And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. So the point of this is that in Matthew 25, we see a time of tribulation that's going to come about beginning in 70 AD or thereabouts, and extending all the way to the end of the age when Jesus returns and sets up his earthly kingdom. Now, the reason that we know that is because it says that, that this is going to be a worse time than anything that ever existed to then, and there never shall be anything more. Well, when you get to Daniel, we know that Daniel, the time frame that Michael stands up is actually in 1952. And this passage says that there will be a time of trouble such as was never since there was a nation. Okay, so you have a disagreement, perhaps, in the text, except that what we're looking at is a time of trouble that spans several thousand years in terms of the Matthew 24 passage. But within that same time period, there's going to be a smaller time period that began in 1952, which is the worst of the worst. So it's not in conflict, it's just in a more narrowed view. So in the broader view is that this time is going to be worse than any time ever, in this broader sense. But within that broader time period, there's a short time period that's going to even be the worst of the worst in that bigger time period. So many consider this a contradiction, and so they kind of just toss the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and whatnot. But that's not the case. This is a very simple clarification. So moving forward then, the sign of thy coming. So when is the sign of the coming of Christ, right? What's going to happen there? Well, that beginning in 23, he says, then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here's Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. So let me pause there for a moment. All right, so we have all these people talking about Christ, or false Christ, false prophet, and the phrase I want to deal with is that this idea of that shall show great signs and wonders. To show means to practice or offer, and great means grandiose. Okay, so the idea of this phrase is that those that will practice or offer people great signs and wonders, or grandiose signs and wonders, okay, like grandstanding kind of thing, amazing, come and see the amazing, okay. And so this is so powerful that, in so much that if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. But see, in the Greek context here, that if it were possible is a subjective possibility. It's not suggesting that they can't be deceived. It's suggesting that it's a very real possibility that they will deceive some, and that the elect, what we would describe as the Christians, would be deceived. And I would suggest to you that this is exactly what's going on today. We see these churches that offer and practice grandiose signs and wonders, and they're deceiving the elect. They're the ones being caught up in all of this. And we have people running around the world trying to get hooked up with these people that do all these signs and wonders, looking for the latest and greatest one, all kinds of things. It's just absurd, some of the stuff that's going on in the church regarding these ideas. And so we see this very thing going on, but we don't recognize it because maybe some of our translations don't pick up what's actually being suggested there. It's not suggesting that these are legitimate signs and wonders. It says they practice or offer these grandiose kind of things, which to people appear to be signs and wonders. It doesn't give them any legitimacy whatsoever. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It suggests that we ought not to be involved in these things. This is not what the Christian life is all about. So, not picking on anyone in general, because I'm as I've said, I'm an equal opportunity offender. Anyone that has a gospel that begins with man being separated from God because of sin is preaching a pagan gospel, and they have a pagan theology. Okay, but I'm just pointing out some of the characteristics of some within that context that the scripture may be addressing specifically. So, going on, behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So here we see the context that Jesus is coming. Okay, that it's going to be a very visible thing. We don't have to go running around looking for Jesus anymore. This idea that, what are these secret chambers? I find that fascinating, some of these words that are translated from the Greek. But it essentially means a collection into one place. Maybe you might even consider it a warehouse or a storehouse of sorts. But any place that's somewhat private, it's not necessarily just open to anybody and everybody. There's a reason for being there. Is the point that we have our little place here, and so it's not that people are excluded. It's just that the people that identify with it, or the things that are identified with it, are what would come to this kind of a private event or private organization. So it also means where one cannot be easily seen. And I find this fascinating because this sounds a whole lot like what we do in church today. I mean, we all collect in our place. We have our little private belief system. We have our own little society and culture, and we certainly are pretty anonymous. Even in terms of many times we'll even completely shut the lights off in these places as we go into what we call worship. And so it's just it's an interesting description. Secret chambers in the Greek has these types of meanings associated with it. So anyway, take it for what it's worth. It's difficult to know exactly what to do with that, except I think the main point in realizing this is, and where my thought process comes, is that you can't go anywhere and have Jesus show up. Jesus will never show up anywhere. We talk about this in our churches. Well, God showed up. Jesus really showed up. No. Jesus never shows up. It's impossible for Jesus to show up because he's in you always, wherever you go. It's not like, you call up your friend and he shows up at your house, right? No. Jesus can't do that. He's not over there. He's in here. So he never shows up. He's always present. This is something we need to understand. So we don't need to be chasing around the world and around everywhere looking for Jesus. No, he's right there. Every time we show up, he's there. You see, that's the point. So Jesus is essentially reestablishing this idea. Don't be going around. And when I do come back in terms of everyone seeing me, trust me, you're not going to miss it. You're gonna know what's happening. So let's take some of these things that we're doing in our churches and realize that we might just be promoting something that is completely anti-Christ and anti-God. Okay, Jesus doesn't show up. He's when you get there, he's already there because he came in you and you're in him, and the two shall never be parted. So the last phrase here, rather interesting as well. For whosoever the carcass, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will be the eagles gathered together. So, eagles don't gather at carcasses. And in looking at the word eagles here, we might think, well, that meant buzzards. Well, no. It's definitely eagles. And so, eagles don't gather where carcasses are. Okay, they go kill their prey while it's still alive. So what does this mean? Well, it could mean a lot of things, but I will make this observation. The eagle is the emblem of many nations through history, and many associate this with the United States, and I think that would be a mistake to identify it as being, the eagle being the United States. It could include the United States. I'm not excluding it, but my suggestion is that the eagle has been used by many nations as part of what they have as their national emblem in some way. And so what we see here is this idea that, wherever the carcass is, which means wherever death is happening, maybe wars and fighting, are going on, and somehow eagles are gathering there. So you may have this idea of nations with eagle emblems coming into areas where there's lots of fighting going on and lots of people dying. So you can make of that what you will, but that seems to be the indication of the text if we identify the eagle with the many different nations that have used that emblem over the years. So moving on with the sign of Christ's coming. So we see this question being answered in terms of the sign of his coming, and he continues on in verse 29 with that. This is the second question still, the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. We saw one verse in verse 27 talking about the coming of the Son of Man. All right, so now he continues on in 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So let me make an observation here. A lot of things have been said about this tetrad event that's happening in 2014 and 2015. And I would agree that it's a very significant event in the sense that it's pretty rare in the context in which it's happening. When you take all of the circumstances, there have only been a few other times. Now, taking it beyond that, I think we may go a little too far. But just taking the idea of solar eclipses and these, what we would call these blood red moons, essentially from these events that are happening in the tetrad. I think it's appropriate to consider this in terms of how close we are to the end and Jesus returning in 2027, because it also gives us another clue here, because it says the stars shall fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Well, a comet was considered a falling star. It was those things beyond the sun and the moon, okay, were considered stars in the sky essentially. Anything beyond that. So like our planets and all that stuff, they don't fit the definition of a star, but in the sky they look like the stars and whatnot that are there. And so distinctively in the scripture we see sun and moon frequently, and then beyond that we hear the term stars that kind of encompasses everything else. But a comet would surely be considered a falling star, even though we're not talking about the strict definition we use of a star. It's a heavenly body that is racing through the sky, and it leaves a trail that can be seen, and so it's a significant event in the heavens. And then it says the power of the heavens shall be shaken. Well, as we know, Iceland blew apart coming around the sun. I mean, if that happened anywhere near us, it would have greatly affected the earth. I mean, we could have had a huge shower of debris and whatnot. And we actually are, I believe, going to fly through, or have flown through the trail of debris that Iceland became after it blew apart going around the sun. That we actually are going to fly through some of that debris, which is so far from where the event happened, actually, that there's really little risk. But imagine if that had happened anywhere near us. So ultimately, Iceland is the falling star, and it is the powers of heaven being shaken. It was a major event. I mean, we're just so far away from it that it didn't really seem like a big deal, but it was. It was a pretty big deal to have this thing blow apart. Now, whether that is what this is talking about or not, I don't know. I'm just trying to give us a frame in which all these things have come together. You have this tetrad event in 2012. The Iceland was first discovered, and then later on, shortly thereafter, it ended up going around the sun and blowing apart. So within this 2012-2015 period, you have all of these things mentioned here addressed. And then it says, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Okay, so this is what we have in terms of the sign of the coming of Christ. And we know it's near. It's just a matter of, okay, which event do we see? So this is not all that important to me, except that it is part of the sign of things to come that we should be watching for. Does the ison and the tetrad fit the scenario? Yes. Is it the one? I don't know. I'm just offering it to us to consider. So moving forward, we're going to come to the next question, the third one. What is the sign of the coming? The sign of the coming of the end of the age. And so at this point, it's important for me to introduce one English word, two Greek words. The word know, K-N-O-W, is translated from the Greek into the English from two different Greek words that mean very different things and impact the text very differently. So the first is gnosko. Okay, it means to know, but it means to know by experience. So typically in the beginning sense of an experience, as you begin to experience it, or in a completed sense, more of a completed sense. It can be, knowing by experience in the present, or coming to know something by experience. There is another usage that I didn't put in my notes, but it talks about having the recollection or memory of an experience that you had previously. That would be a gnosko as well. So if you think back of a memory of activity that you had, some event that you were a part of, that would be a gnosko memory. Okay, you would recall that memory. That is not applied in the text here, but the other aspects of it are. So just keep in mind, gnosko is an experiential knowledge in several different ways. And then the next one is eido, E-I-D-O, which means to see or to know. So for example, it's interesting. You have ha-eido, which means not, not, to see, or not to know. Okay, and that is what we call Hades. Ha-eido. Okay, Hades is a form of ha-eido. So Hades is not to see or not to know. Now whether that's us seeing it or the people there not seeing or not knowing, okay, whatever that means, Hades is typically referred to as a place of the dead. But interestingly, the language itself in the Greek means ha-eido, not to see or not to know. But eido means to be acquainted with, okay, to be aware of, to understand or know or perceive something. So, ha is the opposite of that. But in our